Matt will be pleased to know that we now get to turn to him and turn the presentation over to him this morning. So as I mentioned before, Matt Smith is the New Jersey State Director of Food and Water Watch. And his presentation today will be on community choice aggregation. Matt's work focuses on protecting clean and affordable public water, stopping the expansion of polluting fossil fuel infrastructure, and facilitating a rapid and fair transition to 100% renewable energy economy. Matt also sits on the steering committee of the New Jersey Poor People's Campaign and is a member of the FANG collective, where his work links popular movements for environmental, economic, and social justice. So we couldn't have a better speaker to talk about community choice aggregation. Thank you so much, Matt. Over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak before your organization today. Just to jump right in, again, my name is Matt Smith. I'm the New Jersey Director for Food and Water Watch. We are an international nonprofit organization working to protect clean water, safe food, and a livable climate future for all. We've been around now for 15 years, including here in New Jersey for the last 12 years. And our office in New Jersey is based in New Brunswick, but we have 4 full-time organizing staff in the state of New Jersey who are working in communities across the state. I'm actually originally from Bergen County. I grew up in Wyckoff and have had the pleasure of spending some time at Ethical Culture. Ethical Culture has graciously hosted Food and Water Watch events in the past. So I wanted to start off by thanking your organization for your generosity of spirit. And yeah, also just to share a little bit more about, more broadly about our work in New Jersey before we jump into the real crux of today's presentation on community choice aggregation. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. And even before I get started, I just wanted to very quickly acknowledge that we're on occupied Lenni Lenape land here in New Jersey, and thank the indigenous water protectors out in Anishinaabe territory for literally putting their bodies on the gears of the oil and gas industry's extractive, climate destroying process, particularly with the Line 3 tar sands pipeline that's coming through their territory currently. But yeah, to jump right in, some of you may recognize the photo on the bottom left of our screen, but I wanted to just start really quickly by setting context. Here in New Jersey, we are really on a front line of the expansion of oil and gas, and it's because of our position right next to the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. The Marcellus Shale is the largest fracking play in the US. And so that, New Jersey doesn't have fracking, but we have all of the pipelines, power plants, and other infrastructure to really facilitate the expansion of fracking in the region. And so a big part of our work in New Jersey over the last 10 years has been resisting this expansion. And really, we've had some incredible success starting in most recently in 2019 after a 2-year campaign. And this is some photos from the campaign against the Meadowlands power plant, which was proposed right on the border of Bergen County, on the border of Ridgefield and North Bergen. It would have been the largest polluting facility in the state. 3.2 million tons of carbon annually from the smokestacks. And yeah, so many folks, including many members of Ethical Culture, got involved in that. We passed 52 municipal resolutions, got legislators to join us in opposing the project, and eventually got Governor Murphy to reject that power plant in 2019. And then we followed that up, and this is a photo of the big student-led march that Food and Water Watch and our partners organized. And that was a real, culmination of 18 months of intensive organizing, where we saw hundreds of students and other community members take to the streets to call on the governor to stop that project. And then we followed that up in 2019 with another historic win against fossil fuel expansion. We stopped a major pipeline proposed through central New Jersey in the Raritan Bay. Again, this was to take frack gas and bring it to markets in the Northeast. And again, similarly, this was actually a 4.5-year campaign that saw thousands of people get involved in the political process to pressure every level of government, local, county, state, and eventually got Governor Murphy and his NJDEP to reject the Clean Water Act permits that the project needed to move forward. So that was really a precedent-setting win. And then in February of this year, we made more history when we and our coalition partners won a permanent ban on fracking in the Delaware River Basin. The Delaware River and its tributaries provide drinking water for over 13 million people in the region, including many millions here in New Jersey. The industry had all the way back in 2011 planned to put up to 20,000 new fracking wells in the upper Delaware, the most sensitive part of the ecosystem. And this decision in February marked the culmination of a 10-year fight to get the 4 governors of the watershed states to implement a ban on fracking in the Delaware River Basin. It's still not over. We still need to win a ban on the wastewater that's produced by fracking and the withdrawal of water from the Delaware for fracking, but it was a giant step forward for us. So yeah, what this has shown us is that over the last several years, that if we organize and build political pressure in our communities and link up with other communities, that we can actually fight back against these exploitative projects. And New Jersey Transit was the last and most recent victory we had. Another major frack gas power plant proposed in an environmental justice community. Not only do we get the governor to come out and oppose it, but New Jersey Transit has agreed to redesign their microgrid facility with clean renewables. And this is a picture of a student-led climate strike that we organized at Rutgers Newark in opposition to the gas plant that New Jersey Transit had proposed building and for a clean renewable alternative. Unfortunately, despite those 3 major wins, there are several other fossil fuel expansion projects proposed throughout the state, including another pipeline expansion through the New Jersey Highlands, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Project, including another frack gas power plant proposed in Woodbridge, a LNG export facility proposed in the Delaware. We just banned fracking, and now the industry wants to build a massive liquefied natural gas export terminal to ship LNG overseas for profit at the expense, risk, and danger of our health and safety here in the region. And yet again, another frack gas power plant proposed, this time in the Iron Bound of Newark, one of the most polluted air sheds in the entire country, with childhood asthma rates and other lung disease rates off the charts. It's really criminal that Governor Murphy's own agency, PVSC, has gotten this far. And so we're working again to get the governor to intervene, reject the gas plant, and replace it with a clean, renewable alternative. And these are just some photos from some of our actions. We did a kayak action on the Hackensack River against the aforementioned New Jersey Transit power plant, and a second one where we paddled right up to Governor Murphy's house to remind him of his commitments on climate change and environmental justice, and to call on him not to gas New Jersey. And yeah, so thank you for bearing with that context, not actually the core of the presentation, but I think it really sets the table because, we all know that the science around climate is very urgent. And what we're really up against, aside from the ongoing denialism and obstructionism amongst largely conservative, but some Democrats, we are also up against incrementalism, climate incrementalism, right? The notion that despite the fact that we've made these international commitments, and despite the fact that there's international consensus in the scientific community that we have a decade to have global greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst case scenarios of climate change, the Democratic establishment in the United States is proposing timelines to get off of fossil fuels by 2050. And even then, it's not completely off of fossil fuels because their definition of clean renewable energy is quite different than ours. So we all are very familiar with climate denialism at this point. That's been very exposed in the oil and gas industry's investment in junk science to confuse the American public on climate. But just as big of a threat is the sort of the lack of urgency amongst elected officials on both sides of the aisle in order to tackle this crisis. And that we see how that's playing out in New Jersey, where we have a governor who says all the right things on climate, yet there are still, as you saw, many fossil fuel projects that are still moving forward under his watch. And you can't cut greenhouse gas emissions if you're still allowing new sources of greenhouse gas emissions to be built. So I'm going to transition now to a little bit about community choice aggregation, because unlike all of those other campaigns that we've been leading and involved in to stop bad things, community choice aggregation is actually a solution. So instead of just opposing things, we're actually able to propose a solution-oriented policy that can rapidly transition our towns and cities onto cleaner forms of energy like solar and wind. And so what is community choice aggregation? So in its very simplest form, CCA programs empower local governments to take control of the source of their energy. So the New Jersey Energy Aggregation Act, which was passed in 2004, allows municipalities to, or cooperatives of municipalities, to aggregate the ratepayer resources of their residents and go out to the market and actually, through a public bidding process, select an energy provider that meets the municipality's needs. Now, traditionally, aggregation has been used to reduce costs, and the sort of process behind that is quite simple. When we go to Costco and we buy in bulk, let's say 100 bags of potato chips, we get a better per unit price than when we go into the convenience store to buy a single bag of potato chips. Energy aggregation and the cost savings works the same way. When townships aggregate all of the ratepayer resources for their thousands of residents, they can get a better negotiated rate than any one of their residents can get with the purchasing power of one. So traditionally, again, CCA, community choice aggregation, has been used to provide residents with cost savings. We're using it to, in many instances, provide those cost savings, but also to choose cleaner forms of energy. And one of the really wonderful things about community choice aggregation is that, unlike rooftop solar, unlike many forms of renewable energy, CCA doesn't require any upfront investment from households or from local governments, for that matter. It uses all of the same infrastructure that we're already using, the same billing infrastructure, the same wires, the same delivery utility. The only thing that's changing is the source of the electricity. And that allows it to be an inclusive option for people that, let's say, can't put solar on their homes due to structural issues or shade issues. And the way that, so we've been working on community choice aggregation since 2018, and we have written model legislation that towns have enacted that increases the percentage of renewable energy that their residents are getting in year one, with a goal to get to 100% renewable in 2030. And the reason why we didn't go to 100% renewable right away is in some instances, renewables still are more expensive. A lot of that has to do with the $15 billion that the oil and gas industry is still subsidized annually every year. The cost of new solar installations is actually now the cheapest form of new electricity generation. But for existing sources, oftentimes renewables can still be slightly more than fossil fuels. So we structured our ordinance with a timeline that with 50% renewables in the first year of the program, the towns who are doing this are actually not only increasing renewables above the state minimum. So the state of New Jersey right now, their renewable standard, meaning the percentage of all energy consumed in New Jersey, electricity consumed in New Jersey, has to be 21%. 21% of it has to be from renewable sources. So even in the first year of our program, we're increasing the renewable standard nearly 30% above the state minimum, while offering residents slight savings compared with the incumbent utility, which is again, a mostly gas electricity-based option. And again, getting to that 100% renewable mark by 2030. And why 100% for everyone by 2030? I talked about this a little bit before. Really, it's the urgency in which we act. One of the most interesting things about the struggle for climate justice is that, unlike other historical social movements, we aren't just negotiating with human power, and we actually cannot negotiate with the basic physics of the planet. So that's why this 2030 timeline is so important. It was established by the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change. Their annual report in 2018 really concluded that all the previous models had been far too conservative, and actually, in order to avoid the worst case of climate change, we needed to cut global greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And in the reason why we're going to 100% by 2030 is both because electricity is the easiest source of fossil fuels to transition, and because the United States needs to be a leader. So we want to push for 100% renewable by 2030. And we've had some successes in enacting community choice aggregation programs. Our first was in New Brunswick, where our office is based and where I live in New Jersey. In 2018, we started lobbying our city council, showing up to meetings, and really our calls fell on deaf ears. So we dug up a provision within the city's charter that shows that if you get 10% of voters in the city signed on to a legally binding petition, you can actually force the city council to vote on a local ordinance. And so we started to collect petitions and going door to door in the city, educating voters about the need to get onto cleaner forms of energy. We got the requisite 10% that triggered a public hearing, and then the city actually did pass our ordinance on council reading. So we did not have to go to the ballot in New Brunswick. And really, since that time, it's been a great success because we are seeing not only increases in renewable content, but cost savings through the program, which is really important. And there's many other places that are doing this. Sustainable Essex Alliance is another great example of a cooperative of towns who have come together to start a community choice aggregation program to offer their residents more clean energy at discounted rates, and rates, in fact, that are below the incumbent utility. And so, coming off our success in New Brunswick, we started a campaign in 2019 in Piscataway. We did the same petition initiative process. The Piscataway Town Council did not pass our ordinance, so we were on the ballot in the November 2019 election, where we won after a major get out the vote and education campaign. We won with 64% of voters approving our 100% renewable energy program. And after that win in 2019, we've enacted 5 more programs in Edison, Collingswood, East Brunswick, South Brunswick, and Red Bank. Actually, it's 6 more because Asbury Park is not on this list. And they enacted our ordinance a couple months ago. But similarly, in East Brunswick, we also ended up on the ballot where we won with 70% voter support in support of a 100% renewable energy aggregation program. So we are growing this, and we currently are circulating petition initiatives in 5 towns and cities across the state, including in Ethical Culture's hometown of Teaneck, New Jersey. And yeah, we are rapidly approaching our petition deadline to qualify for the November general election ballot. And that's coming up in just a few weeks. So yeah, after this presentation, I'll be headed out to one of the other 5 towns. We're also doing this in North Brunswick, Woodbridge, Long Branch, and Cherry Hill. So I think I'll be headed to Long Branch, not just because I get to go to the beach after canvassing, as my coworkers often claim that is why I picked Long Branch. And yeah, these are just a couple of photos with a few more Teaneck folks in the top right who had come out for a day of outreach for the Piscataway petition initiative and referendum. And on the left, this was election day, where our staff and volunteers were out talking to voters outside the polls about our public question. And yeah, with that, I am gonna stop the formal presentation there, but hopefully we do have some time for questions. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. That was a lot of information. I'm trying to absorb it all there. So yes, we have plenty of time for questions. I think there will be a lot of questions. I already see there's maybe a couple in the chat. For everybody that wants to ask questions, please remember to ask Matt a question specifically about this topic rather than make a statement. Try and limit your questions to under 1 minute if possible, because if there are a lot of people that want to ask questions, you will be doing them the courtesy of allowing them the time to do that. As Dan and Elaine have already done, raise your hand if you have a question, and David will give you some instructions about that as well. And you can also put your questions in the chat window instead of asking them yourself if you'd like those questions to be read out. And we would very much like to hear from people that don't always ask questions at platforms. So I encourage everybody with a question to raise your hand. I see several there. I'm now going to turn this over to David to manage.
David, unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I have to follow my own advice. We'll start with a new person, a new name, Deborah McConnell. Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, I'm unmuted, I guess. I'm a member of the CCL, Citizens for Climate Lobby.
Yeah.
What is your position? I really liked that, the community aggregation. That seemed really great. What is your position on the CCL community at large? They have a bill in Congress to levy a price on carbon, and that would be given back to the poorer people, the people in New Jersey. What is your position on the CCL program?
Yeah, I mean, it's not directly related to community choice aggregation, and it's not something that we do a lot of work on. There's lots of climate bills moving through Congress. We have a bill that would ban fracking nationally. We're also working, and we also have legislation to stop all new fossil fuel projects and transition our electricity over to 100% renewable by 2030. So, I think that our research has shown that a carbon tax does not always have the intended outcome, even if it's done as a carbon fee and dividend. And I will just say that ExxonMobil supports a carbon tax. Many of the major oil and gas companies support a carbon tax, and it's pretty clear that those companies, just given their history and what they've done to prevent the end of or any curtail of their oil and gas production, it's pretty telling that those entities support a carbon tax. But I don't want to get too far into it, because it's not, just because Food and Water Watch doesn't see that as our top solution doesn't mean there isn't, necessarily, an opportunity with that. But that's kind of where we stand.
Okay, we'll take a question that Linda Bennett put in the chat window. She writes that she'd like to know about how reliability of the power supply will be addressed, number one, and number two, how will these agreements prevent fluctuating, crushing price increases as occurred in Texas?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the nice things about community choice aggregation is what we're doing is really just shifting our money to invest in clean renewable sources. The way the grid works, New Jersey is part of the PJM grid. It's the largest interstate grid operator in the United States. There's 13 states. It goes as far south as Kentucky and as far west as Illinois. And both the PJM grid as well as our state utilities, which are granted monopoly licenses based on the promise and legal commitment that they will provide reliable electricity. So between the interstate grid and our incumbents, those are the entities that are legally responsible for ensuring that regardless of where the electrons are coming from, whether it's renewables or fossil fuel-based generation, that New Jersey can provide reliable electricity to its residents. And, I'm not going to say that's without any imperfections. Certainly those of us, who are here during Sandy and other events can attest to the fact that when these things happen, there have been really serious power outages. And so part of what we need to do in the transition to a renewable energy-based economy is also be prioritizing energy resilience. And in fact, a distributed grid with more renewable energy and more microgrids is actually more resilient. The reason why a fossil fuel grid is so vulnerable is because it's a single point of failure. You have one central grid linked up to a few large power plants. And if you get a point of failure at any one of those plants or anywhere along the transmission line, the whole grid can go down. Whereas with distributed renewables, especially tied into a microgrid system, an outage in one area would not affect power reliability in another. So again, with CCA, all we're doing is shifting our money as a municipality instead of paying it to, support fossil fuel-based energy. We're shifting it to renewable energy supply. And it doesn't actually change the electrons that are coming into your home or the electrons that are going through, the grid in New Jersey. All it's doing is shifting our investment and really signaling to the market that more and more towns and more communities throughout the state are wanting cleaner forms of energy. And in Texas, the last thing I'll close on is just by a real quick piece on Texas that had, while there were a couple of instances of mechanical failure, of wind turbines and other infrastructure, the real issue in Texas was decades of deregulation, a refusal by the state of Texas to participate in a shared interstate grid network like New Jersey's in with PJM, so that the oil and gas companies could have unfettered profits. And that was the real failure, because they had no redundancy in the system, no ability to shift energy generation from other states into the Texas grid when that deep freeze happened.
Okay, Jesse Glass, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, we've in my town, there have been the environmental committee has already had 2 meetings about setting up a community choice aggregation program, which is awesome. But like for us personally, I've already selected an electricity provider, Clean Choice Energy, that's 100% renewable. Although I know what my understanding is, the electrons that you say are actually coming from fossil fuel, but they buy vouchers for renewable energy with that money. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes.
So how do I how do I best serve? Do I join the community choice aggregation, or do I keep 100% of renewable energy? But I know that it's the voucher system. It's not actually the electron from a solar panel that are powering my house. How do I make my pennies go the furthest to help further this?
Yeah, totally. And so community choice aggregation works very similarly to the third-party provider you have. So the benefit of the community choice program is that, again, it's the collective purchasing power of an entire town's ratepayer dollars that can typically negotiate a better rate as well as a fixed rate. Most of the third-party providers, if you go as an individual, it'll be a variable rate. Yeah, I'm not saying all, but most are. In terms of the vouchers or renewable energy credits, that's unfortunately the system that the state of New Jersey and many other states throughout the country have. So that's kind of what I was talking about, where it's not changing the electrons. The electrons would still be coming from a mix of all different forms of energy, but by shifting our ratepayer dollars into renewable energy, we're sending signals to the market that the grid in the future should be more renewable energy based. So it's really about decreasing demand for fossil energy by shifting our money out of that and putting it into cleaner renewable forms of energy to incentivize demand. Our community choice aggregation program does have a 100% renewable energy option in year one. It's just the default starts at 50, and that's based on energy affordability. We want to make sure that we're not raising people's bills by choosing clean energy. And in fact, in some of the towns we've done this, even the 100% renewable energy option has been cheaper than the incumbent utility, including in the Sustainable Essex Alliance. So it just depends on what the township or the county is able to negotiate with an energy supplier.
Teresa Regatas in the chat window writes, it seems as though there may be a shortage of renewable energy sources. From what you're saying, how will that be addressed?
So in terms of a shortage in the big picture, macro, yes, like we need to be rapidly developing more renewable energy in order to get off of fossil fuels and decommission the most polluting plants in the state. But in terms of meeting current demand, there is no shortage. What the way the electricity market works is that when these companies, like many markets, they're forecasting demand out 3, 5, 10 years into the future. So in a community like Teaneck, which we're hopeful we will win our campaign after our petition initiative gets certified. What that will do is send a signal to the market, not that, oh, like we need to scramble to build a plant to meet Teaneck's demand. It's more about what is the future of energy demand looking like if Teaneck is doing this today. And so the market is receiving signals to build more renewable energy plants for future demand, right? Not to meet Teaneck's demand, but because if Teaneck's doing it, chances are more and more communities will be doing it. So like many markets, they're looking out. And again, the energy regulators who manage the interstate grids are tasked with maintaining energy reliability.
Orion Hopper, you're next. Please unmute yourself and state your question.
I have two questions. One, as a Teaneck resident, I've already signed the petition, but assuming we get enough signatures to get this on the ballot in November, what is the next step as far as canvassing the general populace to get on board? And second question is, why is the mayor of Piscataway corresponding with the mayor of Teaneck and telling him not to get involved?
Yes, so to answer the first question, we will have a chance to actually have Teaneck City Council or Town Council pass the ordinance should we reach our 10% signature goal and the clerk certifier petition. We anticipate that hearing would take place in August. And so we would want to get people to that council meeting. If they don't approve it, then it goes to ballot in November. So we'd really start to ramp up our voter outreach in the months of September and October, leading into the November general election. That will include some door-to-door, some community events. It will include a digital outreach campaign, phone banking. So there'll be lots of opportunities. And what I can do is put some links in either the chat here, or I already did commit to share the presentation with Ann and David. So maybe I could put a couple links in there as ways that people could take action or sign up to be involved in an effort. And then in terms of Piscataway, I'm sure I'm going to shock no one by saying that New Jersey politics are, in many ways, the machine politics, the sort of transactional, political mantra of trying to really control the system for your benefit and the benefit of your small inner circle. That exists across the country, but the playbook was written in New Jersey. And in Piscataway, we have an establishment that, even though they are Democratic in name, their top priorities are to really reward politically connected land developers, to do big development projects, and they see any sort of outside progressive reformers or activism or citizen engagement is antithetical to what they want, which is, nobody looking at what they're doing, nobody involved in local government. They, call the shots. And so the idea that we would put a referendum on the ballot was just, they've spent an inordinate amount of time just coming after us, attacking our organization, and also trying to undermine our efforts in other towns. But we did respond to the mayor's press release, particularly calling light to the fact that instead of attacking Food and Water Watch for putting clean energy petitions on the ballot, if they really care about their residents, they should stop building these massive trucking depots in environmental justice communities, which they're doing to, again, benefit the politically connected developers in the town.
Okay, Elaine or Dan, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, so I hope this is a slow pitch, an easy one to answer. But so when we look at global warming, this is a global problem. And even if New Jersey were to go in 9 years to 100% carbon-free economy, New Jersey would be one drop in an ocean where there are 49 other states and 190 some odd other countries in which the vast majority of the world's population and carbon sources live. So it only makes sense for this sort of campaign and action to happen if it's part of a larger national and international drive. Otherwise, it won't matter, because global warming, unlike local pollution, is a global problem. So can you describe how the current effort in New Jersey is part of a larger national and international campaign? Thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Dan, and thanks for raising it. We don't have the time or the resources to pass 100% renewable CCA programs in the 546 municipalities in the state of New Jersey. I would have no hair left on my head by the time that happened. And so our strategy with this campaign is really to be passing these local laws in key state and federal legislative and congressional districts. Because again, I mentioned at the top that the current proposals from the Democratic Party, both at the state level and federally, are calling for 100% so-called clean energy by 2050, which we know is just too little, too late, and defies all of the science at the rate in which we need to transition off of fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So by picking these towns in key congressional districts, for example, half of the 11 CCA local laws, 100% renewable energy laws we've passed are in Congressman Pallone's district. Pallone is the ranking member and chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which makes him probably the most powerful person in the House when it comes to climate policy, because it would have to go through his committee in order for it to pass. So we're passing these 100% renewable by 2030 ordinances in his district because especially Palone, but many federal and state politicians are really influenced by their constituent municipalities, the positions and policies they're taking. And so we're trying to push Palone to take a more aggressive stance and improve his federal climate legislation by showing him that the towns in his district support more rapid action on climate. And I think in terms of international, we do have organizers in Europe, in Latin America, not as many as we have in the US, but I do think that our role in the United States has to be as the out front leader in making this aggressive transition. You know, so much of the world still looks to the United States as the economic and cultural leader of the world. And we also share the largest historical burden. The United States is the single largest historical producer emitter of climate pollution. And so we have the most to do. We also have the most wealth and technology and resources. So we really think that by getting the United States to take an aggressive position, it can open up opportunities for international diplomacy. And for example, Bernie Sanders' plan for a Green New Deal, which we support, actually establishes a global technological fund and investment funds to the tune of $200 billion to assist developing countries with their transition to renewable and make sure that, you know, many of them still don't have electricity. So as they're developing their first electrical grid, that it comes not with coal or fracked gas, but comes through a distributed renewable energy-based grid.
Eric Sandhusen, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, great. Very enjoyable presentation. And I just want to say an aside to Deborah McConnell, I'm a big fan of the CCL. My sister is a active lobbyist in Massachusetts for the CCL, and my brother's getting active in Montclair for that. But that's a little bit of an aside for that. And Matt, I want to say I'm really glad to see these type of demand side solutions rather than supply side solutions, because while it's while I can be against oil and be against pipelines and all those things, those are really supply side solutions. And what's hard is to use less energy or to pay more for the clean energy or to do the things that are really within my particular individual control. And so I like the idea of this, the CCA. I guess I would like to get a little bit more information perhaps about maybe the nuts and bolts. That is to say, maybe two questions. Once a town or township or has decided to approve this on a local level, you talked about there being some negotiating on behalf of the residents. And I guess I'm curious where the expertise or the support or the information to do that type of negotiation actually happens. And related to that, I see that most of the towns that you're seeking to move ahead with are larger towns. I live in a smaller town, and so I guess I'm curious as to what the real opportunities or benefits or maybe pitfalls are for a smaller town to opt in for something like this.
Yeah, so thanks, Eric. And in terms of nuts and bolts, the way that community choice aggregation works is municipalities pass what's called enabling legislation or authorizing legislation to start a program. And that's really the first step. That's like what creates it. And so what I was talking about before is we've gotten towns and cities to pass that authorizing legislation, both through traditional advocacy campaigns, just asking them to do it. And they see there's enough support, and usually there's some education involved in that, and then they get on board and they pass it. In the towns where we're doing petition initiative and referendum, those councils, did not agree that, they didn't say it was something they wanted to take up. They sort of ignored us and the community advocates. And so that's why we went to the petition initiative. But once, whether you enact it through referendum or through city council vote, the town then goes out and they typically retain a consultant. And the consultant's job is to do an energy profile for the town and to create an RFP based on that energy profile. And the RFP is the document that gets sent out to renewable energy companies or energy companies at large, and they see that RFP and then they can respond to it by making a bid. And so it's done through competitive bidding process, just like any other government acquisition. So the lowest bidder who can meet the town's energy needs gets the contract, and the consultant is actually their rate, which is reasonable, is built into the winning bid price, so that there's no out of pocket for the township, which is a big benefit to towns, that there's no expenditures associated with it, and there's no real staffing needs for it. The town has minimal responsibilities. You need to work with a consultant typically to create an informational piece that goes out to residents, but the consultants largely do that, sometimes to create a website so that residents can get more information or ask questions online. But yeah, it's pretty light, very light, low overhead for towns to start this. And that whole process from passing the authorizing legislation to awarding a winning bidder and launching the program is typically about 12 to 18 month process, start to finish. And and for smaller towns, yeah, because of the bulk purchasing benefits, what we've seen work best for smaller towns is to join with other towns or even a county program. So we've been working with the Bergen County, and they are finally now getting ready to launch a countywide energy aggregation program to achieve 100% renewables by 20 or 30 or sooner. And what I hear from the administration is that they're going to be passing their enabling legislation in August. And that would be a great opportunity for Bergen County towns to simply opt into the county program, because it's even easier than launching their own. Plus they would get the cost benefits of bulk purchasing with their neighboring towns and not just the small population that they have.
Okay, Linda Bennett, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, I have several questions. Let me preface this, because I'm going to push back on some things, that this is a concept I definitely support, but I have concerns about. First of all, can you address what are renewable sources? I mean, we're aware of the wind turbines and the solar panels. The fact that these are intermittent sources of power, because we do not have the battery power yet to store electricity. So if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, where's the electricity going to come from? Right now it's coming from gas, which is better than coal. But so I'd like you to go over that and what the status of that is. And secondly, that we were talking about the large companies like PSE&G and Dominion Energy down in the South, which I know something about, are undertaking huge renewable energy projects. They're being prodded into them. There's no question about that. But huge wind turbines off the coast of the Atlantic and so on. But our technology is not there yet. So how do we, I guess, to me, ignoring and fighting it and saying, we're cutting out PSE&G, we're cutting out this, isn't necessarily the way to go, because they have the power and the size to be effective. Now, this kind of thing that you're doing, these CCAs, that is changing the demand. That is going to help to push this, which I think is great. But I don't see a role there that I think should be there to make big energy companies promote this too.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. And I'll start with the last question and just say that PSEG themselves have announced they're going to be divesting from all of their fossil fuel generation assets by 2030. They are also getting out of the generation business in general. The only generation assets that they have any long-term plans to hold on to are their two nuclear facilities in South Jersey, and even those will eventually need to be decommissioned. Both of them are operated beyond their useful lives, and wouldn't be possible without PSE&G getting $300 million in annual subsidies from us to run. But PSE&G, because they're getting out of generation, they are investing in their distribution business, as well as energy efficiency, and even directly into renewable energy projects. That's why they haven't really opposed what we're doing, because they don't want to be building and operating power plants in the state anymore. And they are quite fine to allow for community choice aggregation to incentivize more renewable energy projects to come onto the grid. In terms of renewables and what they are, we define renewables a little bit differently than some, like Congressman Pallone, who, his definition of clean renewable energy includes things like fracked gas, as long as you are capturing the carbon from the smokestacks. Meanwhile, carbon capture technology is unproven, highly expensive, and it does nothing to address the toxic co-pollutants that are affecting people's lungs, health, particularly in pollution overburdened communities like Newark, New Jersey. So we define renewables as solar, wind, battery storage, hydro, and certain types of fuel cells. If the fuel cells are being, the hydrogen for the fuel cells is being produced by renewables. And the piece about storage is critical, but the other piece about intermittency is that the reason why interstate grid transmissions are so important is because what it allows us to do is when the sun, let's say it's raining or cloudy in New Jersey, but it's very sunny in Ohio, or very windy in Illinois, those interstate grids can actually transfer electricity from where it's currently in high abundance to where it's needed most, particularly like a cloudy or non-windy area in the grid. So we definitely need to build more interstate transmission lines. Has to be a big part of the transition to 100% renewables. And then energy storage is another key part. So the batteries are definitely getting better, both in terms of cost effectiveness and the length in which they can operate. And then there's all sorts of promising technologies emerging around hydro and other ways to store energy. But I also think that conservation is probably the #1 piece of all of this, right? Like the United States cannot go on with the rates of consumption that we have had historically, nor can the rest of the world develop along the consumption patterns that the United States has had in terms of electricity. Part of that is that our grid is so outdated that 30 to 40% of all electricity produced dissipates before it ever reaches a meter or a home. And so upgrading our federal grid can actually reduce energy demand by up to 30 or 40% just by itself. But again, I think a lot of it has to do with a accompanying political and cultural change that actually rewards the types of behaviors that we're going to need as a hot and crowded planet heading into the later years of the 21st century. And so I'm really excited about the pieces of policy proposals that are about reducing, like, for example, the numbers of hours worked per week, and having more time off and more time to spend with our family and friends. And maybe that means we're earning a little bit less money. But those are some of the trade-offs. Maybe we can't just jump on a plane every time we get an itch to travel the world and go internationally. Maybe that has to be curtailed in order to stay within Earth's bounds. But if that means that I can actually have a 6-week summer vacation, the way much of the rest of the developed world has, instead of the, pathetic 2 weeks that many in our workforce have today. Not to mention paternity and maternity leave, all the ways in which we can really create rewarding, joyful lives that aren't hinged to increased consumption, particularly of fossil fuels. So that was a long-winded answer, but I hope I addressed some of your good questions.
We have another question from the chat window. Jim Griffin asks about the solar panels that PSE&G installed on their utility poles which started about 10 years ago. He asks where that money came from to do that, and what were the results? Was it a waste of money? Was it successful?
It was a mixed bag. And I'm not an expert. I was not working on it. And so I don't hold all of the inner details. But, like many things, PSE&G, they have a tremendous amount of political power. I've been in the State House when their lobbyists are out, and it's a veritable army. And, when PSE&G, just to give an example of what they're able to convince the State Board of Utilities to do, when in 2019, when there was the big debate over whether or not to subsidize the 2 nuclear plants in New Jersey and South Jersey that PSE&G owns and operates, there was widespread opposition to the subsidies, and from all sectors of society. It was actually a strange coalition of environmentalists and other energy consumers like manufacturing and chemical companies. We were all saying, like, at minimum, PSE&G needs to show us the books, show us that they can't operate profitably without the $300 million in annual subsidies they're asking for. So they got the subsidies. They never had to even show their books to the state of New Jersey. So that's just an example of the kind of policy and political muscle that the state's largest regulated monopoly utility has. And I think that's indicative of why sometimes a project that really they're designing and lobbying on behalf of might have some benefits, right, by increasing the amount of renewables on the grid, but ultimately, might be very wasteful and not the most efficient or cost-effective way, or way that truly benefits the public and puts the public good first, as opposed to the profits of the monopoly utility.
Back in the chat window, Samantha Stankiewicz asks if there is a push to ask larger buildings to reduce their temperature. I think she means increase their temperature by 2 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, demand response is a big part, again, of how we solve for intermittency, and how we get onto a renewable-based grid. And, that's a hard one. No one wants to be told, especially in, the United States of America, where we've been sold a bill of hyper-individualism as freedom for hundreds of years since our founding. No one wants to be told that they can't set the thermostat to the exact temperature that they want anytime they want, because it's theirs, right? So there's a lot of onion that needs to be peeled back, and a real paradigm shift and cultural shift that I think needs to happen, which, I think, again, when we're involved in the political process, we get better policy. If we win good policy, people will experience the benefits of it. And, if people are saving money and having a higher quality of life because of less pollution, like, that is the way to get more and more people to agree to the kinds of, collective program things and cultural things that needs to be a part of a just transition to a renewable economy. And when we're not involved and we let the monopolies and those in office who do their bidding set policy, we see what happens in France with the Yellow Vest movement. Like, that was a working class reaction to neoliberal energy policy. Now, that policy was in support of renewables, but it actually increased energy cost for average working people, and they rebelled. So I'm not saying I agree with the Yellow Vest movement. I certainly don't, but we have to be, very clear-eyed about, you know, if we go to renewables and we're not prioritizing working people and making sure it's affordable and reliable, it's never going to work. And in fact, it'll set us back further than it progresses us.
Okay,
Can I just add one thing to that about the 2 degrees? The reason I mentioned that is that my sister-in-law used to work in a hospital and my brother works in a power plant. And she came home one day saying that she needed to buy more sweaters on a day when he's like running around the power plant trying to shut off the lights in the bathroom so that they don't trip the plant. And it really got me thinking about it because schools, for example, are terrible about temperatures. We waste so much energy. We have windows open in the winter and can't get our air conditioners cranking high enough in the summer. The supermarket is so cold that I can't stay in there long enough to finish a shopping trip without a sweater on, right? So like, I feel like I don't hear a conversation that is a public conversation saying like, what is too cold? Can we bring this down? Because my brother was saying like, if everybody just increased their temperature by 2 degrees, it would make a huge difference. And I don't know if that's a conversation that's public.
Yeah, I think it needs to be more public. I think where it's happening is at the larger energy consumer side. Like they see the benefit of turning down their energy demand by those 2 degrees during peak demand because they can save their company millions of dollars for doing it. And so the demand side reduction is happening in the industrial and commercial space. In the residential space, I do think that it's the cultural barriers that are the single biggest to like nobody even wants the smart thermometers in their house because they think, you know, not everyone, but there is a significant percentage of society that thinks like the government is putting those in so that they can, I don't know, spy on them and their families, right? And yes, the NSA is real. There is lots of government overreach and spying, but like, how do we parse the need for collective action, as you're saying, to do pragmatic things, right? Like 2 degrees is not going to kill us. And, you know, it can be a huge part of the overall solution. So, but yeah, I agree. It needs to be more of a public dialogue around that.
Now I have a question. Why shouldn't nuclear be not just a part of the mix, but a big part of the mix? It is by far of all the, it's extremely reliable. If you look at the environmental costs of nuclear versus say coal or gas, nuclear by far is cleaner. So if climate change represents an existential threat to the planet, shouldn't every option short of that be on the table, including nuclear? You're on mute, I think.
Our position at Food and Water Watch is that nuclear energy is not a clean, renewable form of energy. We understand that it's lower emissions than fossil fuels and that for some time, there might need to be nuclear plants operating. However, when you look at the cradle to grave life cycle production of nuclear from the mining of uranium on largely indigenous lands in the US Southwest, where their water supplies have been completely poisoned, and to the production of nuclear waste, which we saw with Fukushima, the release of untold volumes of radioactive waste into our oceans that will have long-lasting ramifications for generations. And that was just one single nuclear plant. There are hundreds of similarly sized nuclear plants operating in floodplains, in coastal zones, which are all vulnerable to climate change. Our country has no long-term plan to safely treat or store this nuclear waste. So the idea that we would produce more of it, more nuclear plants, before we actually get our proverbial stuff together with the existing nuclear vulnerability that we have, is not a position that Food and Water Watch supports. And not to mention the fact that nuclear is more expensive than renewables. The only reason why these nuclear plants are operating, again, look at PSE&G. They're getting $300 million in annual subsidies for 2 plants. That's a huge amount of money, far more than any, than subsidies for renewables. And so for all of those reasons, we don't see nuclear long-term as part of the mix.
Okay, Elaine or Dan, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, actually, my question here is in some ways the opposite of the previous one when I'd asked about global, and this is much more a demand side question, and it actually relates to directly to natural gas rather than to electricity. I presume that one of the major demand sources for natural gas is residential natural gas, residential heating, residential cooking. There was a spate of interesting articles that came out last year, pointing to a much longer history of articles, raising the issue that actually residential use of natural gas for heating is not necessarily the healthiest, for cooking especially, is not necessarily the healthiest way to go, because you're burning something inside your house. And that creates internal pollution that may or may not affect some people. It also obviously is creating a direct demand for carbon fuel. Is there any activism towards not building new residential structures with natural gas, using only electricity, which can be more cleanly and not just cleanly, but carbon-free generated? And even any activism towards retrofitting existing residential structures away from natural gas for heating and cooking towards electricity, especially where renewable electric sources are available?
Yeah, another great question, Dan. There is a lot of activism around this. In fact, California now has a forthcoming ban on gas hookups for new construction. New York, at their Public Service Commission, which is the equivalent to our Board of Utilities, they have proceeding right now around the state of New York's climate law, which requires the state to get to carbon neutral by 2040. And they're also looking at similar proposals to ban new gas hookups and require that all new construction be built on heat pump or geothermal heat sources. And those are also available for home conversions. Again, I think where the rubber hits the road is the cost, because those systems are more expensive, especially for existing homes where all the ducts and everything were built for like a central burner, not a heat pump or geothermal. So I think that is why the solution has to be in part federal. Right, when we look at what our federal government is spending on, I literally think the number was like it's $1 trillion to upgrade our nuclear arsenal over the next 10 years. Like, that's what Congress wants to spend, right? And what we could do with that 1 trillion if we just decided to disinvest from the nuclear arms race and invest in the race against climate collapse, we would get us all of the way there. So it's not like the money isn't there. It's just the cost can't be borne by working people because it will never work. And so we need that federal investment to actually make sure that these solutions are available to all people, not just those that can afford it.
And we have time for one more question, and that will also come from the chat window from Linda Bennett. Are you knowledgeable about the Township of Wayne, which installed solar panels on its municipal complex some years ago? I'll mention TNEC did the same thing. Do you have any idea of how well that's gone? If it's been a success?
I actually don't. No, I have not followed either of those two projects. Okay. Sorry.
We require you to know about every town in the state.
Let me add just a little. It was interesting because it was a long time ago. And what Wayne did is it has a central municipal complex and at least a high school, if not more schools, all in the same area. So it put solar panels up on the building to at least supply the power supply for the entire complex and the schools in that area. And that was a real forerunner project in New Jersey. That's a long time it's been going. And I don't know, how it's been doing, but it was interesting. 20 years ago? It's a
Yeah.
long time. And
Right.
I'm just curious about, it didn't seem to take off. Somebody was very forward looking there, but it didn't seem to take off with other municipalities where it would make so much sense.
Yeah. Yeah, there is so much potential and so many exciting projects that are happening right now.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And we'll turn it back to
Yes,
you.
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matt. I think everybody will join me in applauding the wonderful presentation and all of the questions that you fielded, many of them not about community choice aggregation. So I guess there's a lot of interest in, in energy and renewables in general. So that was great. You sense that we're a community that cares about this kind of thing. And thank you to all of the people that had questions. They were all smart, thoughtful questions. And I'm in awe of all of you. I'd also like to thank David Bland, who was our Zoom master today, a masterful Zoom master, I must say. And obviously, again, thank you to anybody that attended today. Thank you to all of our members and non-members and visitors who joined in. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.